for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes 2 study session items. Seeing there are no concept reviews on the agenda this evening, there will not be any public comment. The study session will be televised on Channel 8 and through live streaming on Broomfield's website. For our hearing impaired residents present, we have wireless headsets available through our AV team in the back of the council chambers. The City Council study session meeting is called to order. This evening, Councilmember Marshall Olson is joining us virtually. I don't know if he's on yet. Holler if you are. And a quorum's present, even though we don't need a quorum for study sessions. Our first agenda item this evening is a study session and request for council's direction related to off-street and bicycle parking code. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council and Ms. Burton-Zetti. It's really the Ms. Burton-Zetti show tonight because she's got the next 2 items.
Take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, City Council. If I could have the next slide, please. The first item on tonight's study session agenda is a discussion on updating Broomfield's parking requirements for new developments. Overall, the goals of this project were to modernize the off-street parking code requirements and establish bicycle parking requirements to ensure we are meeting current best practices. The off-street parking code requirements that are in the municipal code really haven't been significantly updated since 1998 or possibly even earlier. The motivation for reviewing and modernizing this section of code is rooted in the policy guidance from the 2016 comprehensive plan, as well as the January 2023 study session where we talked about updating zoning requirements and policy and planning documents for new developments. To achieve the project goals, it required staff to consider a number of factors. This included making sure that our land use categories are appropriate and consistent with other municipalities in our region. We wanted to explore instituting parking maximums as a best practice to avoid overparking, new developments. And we wanted to propose the use of a 2-tiered set of parking requirements, recognizing that there are different parking needs when there is available access to transit in areas such as Arista and our other transit-oriented development areas. We also wanted to review and update the technical guidance for parking lots and parking stalls. And finally, a recent best practice was identified with the need for bicycle parking requirements to support travel choice. Bicycle parking standards are particularly important for multifamily developments and at places where people work. Next slide, please. To understand local and regional off-street parking approaches, staff collected and reviewed numerous parking codes from regional municipalities and analyzed each other's land use densities to understand how we compared to those other developments. We wanted to make sure we were apples to apples comparing similar communities. Staff also conducted a review of the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the ITE parking studies, to study actual parking rates, average parking code requirements, and evaluate our land use types based on observational studies collected nationally as well as in Canada. ITE is an authority for transportation and traffic planning and was relied on by other municipalities across the nation for this type of technical guidance. Broomfield staff reviewed a wide range of studies, articles, expert groups, and regional and state recommendations. This included review of Colorado's greenhouse gas reduction roadmap, mitigation action plan, strategies for parking codes that are in support of the state GHG goals. Next slide, please. This image illustrates the ITE parking application interface used by staff to review and develop the proposed off-street parking code requirements. On the left side of the image is a sortable category for things like the land use type and land use context. For example, is it urban or suburban, and how parking is measured, such as bedrooms, the units, the gross floor area, number of employees. On the right side, it provides key statistical information such as the average parking usage rates and the number of studies the data was sourced from. The ITE parking application provides additional detail regarding each land use type, and this allowed staff to better understand the commonly accepted definitions for land uses nationwide. Staff reviewed the ITE data for every land use in our parking code, as well as for other land uses Broomfield considered for changes to the code. All of the research was then brought together to draft changes for the code to ensure our requirements make sense for Broomfield and are comparable to regional and national trends. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates some of the major changes to land use types that were proposed along with this update in the draft. A goal with these changes was to simplify land uses that we felt were redundant or had similar parking needs. An example is the animal kennel or animal hospital use being combined with medical office and clinic. These are pretty similar land uses and have nearly identical parking requirements. So based on that, based on staff's research, and the reasoning supported combining these land use categories and thereby simplifying our requirements. We also found there were some land uses in our code that were not represented in the research and are very uncommon, such as a membership building. These types of land uses very rarely come through the development process, and we can base parking requirements on a very unlikely or rare land use type based on the parking demand analysis that can be required as part of a traffic impact study if those types of uses come in. Next slide, please. A number of new land use types were also added to the draft. These use types were added because Broomfield either sees them more frequently in the development review process or because they have distinct parking requirements that can't adequately be accounted for in the existing land use types. As part of the draft update, staff included parking maximums as a new requirement. Best practices for off-street parking requirements suggest the use of parking maximums being desired to avoid significantly over parking new development areas. A few exceptions for parking maximums are being suggested in the draft, including instances where parking is structured or when a parking study shows that excess parking is actually needed for meeting the demands of a particular use. The parking maximums suggested are 125% of the parking minimum. In TOD areas where parking minimums are reduced, the parking maximum would be set at the non-TOD parking minimum. In most cases, it's pretty unlikely the developers would seek to far exceed parking maximums due to the cost of constructing and maintaining additional parking spaces, but including the maximums provides guidance to developers within the development review process. Next slide, please. One of the key changes included in the draft code for discussion is changes to the amount of parking required for some of the land uses. Notably, multifamily housing required reductions in parking across the board. Specific requirements were also included for income-aligned multifamily housing and senior multifamily housing, ensuring these unique types of housing included appropriate requirements for off-street parking consistent with what has been required by developers and is used in best practices. The recommended rates for off-street parking were based on national and regional research released within the last handful of years. Similarly, some uses such as drive-through and fast casual restaurants required very high parking rates as compared to best practices in our current code. And these rates were brought into alignment with regional and national standards to avoid requiring too many parking spaces for new establishments. Next slide, please. Best practices and off-street parking requirements suggest that it is appropriate to have overlay zones where there are lower parking requirements related to transit-oriented development areas. This is also consistent with the guidance in Colorado's greenhouse gas reduction plan. In Colorado's mitigation action plan, it recommends eliminating parking minimums in these areas, but based on staff's research, the elimination of parking minimums was found to be appropriate in ultra-dense urban core areas or high transit-rich areas, and did not find that those strategies were appropriate for Broomfield. The draft regulations include a reduction in parking minimums of 20% for most land uses in these areas, except for single-family residential. Staff also suggested reducing parking maximums in these areas, as I previously mentioned, to the non-TOD parking minimums. In the future, staff intends to explore the introduction of transit demand management options for Broomfield. TDM, as it's called, strategies adopted by developers could help further could help support further reductions in parking minimums in all areas of Broomfield, but particularly in TOD areas that are best suited to support transportation choice. Next slide, please. Well, slightly difficult to see on this, on the screen, Brimfield staff has developed recommendations for 3 TOD areas that would be subject to the reduced parking requirements for the land uses. The second tier of parking requirements is being recommended for a number of reasons as identified in the staff report. The TOD areas shown on this map attempt to take into account areas with similar land use densities, a solid and improving path network, access to transit, and within appropriate distance for bicycle trips. In addition, staff attempted to use major transportation barriers such as major arterials and railroads to set reasonable boundaries for these areas. The TOD areas proposed in this map are, of course, subject to change based on feedback from City Council, and additional TOD areas may be appropriate to be designated in the future, such as along 120th Avenue or US 287 as Brimfield land uses change over time. Next slide, please. In addition to proposing updated off-street parking requirements, Brimfield staff also is bringing forward a proposal to establish bicycle parking requirements for new developments. Next slide, please. Staff's approach for drafting these requirements for City Council's direction was to research bicycle parking that mirrors that for off-street parking. This included reviewing local municipal code requirements, although there are far fewer for us to compare since bicycle parking requirements are much newer than vehicle parking requirements. Review of national code examples, review of studies, articles, and expert guidance on best practices, and heavy reliance on the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals bicycle parking guidance reports that provides policy guidelines for bicycle parking for both short and long-term parking. Next slide, please. Bicycle parking in the draft code is proposed for both long-term and short-term requirements. Short-term bicycle parking is defined as a location where the public would be leaving bicycles for less than 2 hours. It's appropriate generally across all land use categories. Long-term bicycle parking is for anything over two hours, where appropriate, most appropriate at multifamily residential, offices and office parks, and flex industrial complexes and parks. Expectations for short-term and bicycle parking are typically just U-racks in convenient locations near the building, but long-term bicycle parking requires higher levels of security, potentially, for example, a designated room with different types of bicycle racks. Locations for long-term bicycle parking are key with rooms being located on the ground floor, ideally close to building entrances. At workplaces, they may also have access to shower facilities for employees. Next slide, please. The proposed bicycle parking code includes, as I mentioned, both short and long-term requirements based on the land use type, and the land uses are identical to those in the off-street vehicle parking requirements. The most robust requirements are reserved for multifamily residential uses, as well as office type work environments that would have the most number of employees, with lesser requirements for service industries, commercial and retail land uses. The code requirements also include technical guidance, outlining the types of security measures necessary for long-term bicycle parking, acceptable locations for both the short-term and the long-term parking, and the types of racks that would be permitted for both types of parking. Next slide, please. Staff this evening is requesting direction regarding the potential parking requirement modifications. We provided 4 key questions in the staff memorandum, and I also have them on the screen. These are whether a 2-tiered approach to parking is desired. This is again the non-transit oriented development and transit oriented development separate requirements. If a 2-tiered requirement is directed, then should that TOD overlay area shown on the map that we provided in the memo and on the screen be modified? For example, is it too restrictive? Should it be broadened? Is it too broad? Should it be more restrictive? And then third, does council support the use of the parking maximums in the code? And does council support the request for both long-term and short-term parking requirements for new development? And as I conclude, I just wanted to make sure it's clear for those listening in the community. Again, these would be new parking requirements applicable to new developments that are coming in and would not require modification to existing facilities. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you for the great information, Ms. Burton-Zetti. We will go to council member questions and comments next. Who would like to go first? It looks like you, Councilmember Ward.
I guess I'll have to start us off. I was kind of hoping to see where everyone else landed first, but oh well. So my thoughts on this are we're not going far enough. I would rather us completely eliminate parking minimums and go strictly to parking maximums that are more restrictive, especially in the transit-oriented development areas. I think the transit-oriented overlays that are outlined in the presentation are fair. They go over areas where there's either an existing transit-oriented development, such as Arista, or in the case with North End, there's still future development that can happen that we have time to change course on. So I think those are fine. Yes, I would support the use of parking maximums. I think for bike parking, I don't have a problem with defining differences between long and short-term parking. I think for short-term parking though, let me pull up the 15 pages I have. I think I'd like to see more requirements, like a higher minimum for the short-term parking. I don't think in many instances it accounts for where we should be going. I think it accounts for where we are currently right now. And I'd also like to see probably a requirement that they at least be covered for the short-term parking, just simply to protect from, if it rains or hails or something like that. It's, as someone who bikes, it's rather annoying to try and wipe off the seat if I don't have a towel, because it just decided to rain for a hot second. Going back to the two-tiered requirements, I think particularly in the multifamily housing, there were some slight changes that were made to the requirements, but I think we should be doing better. In my personal opinion, looking at other studies that the US has, given that the US is not a prime example of bikeability, walkability, transit, et cetera, doesn't push the needle far enough to where we need to be going. And for those who are going to say, well, we don't have any transit, that's true, but this is for new development that's not coming for, well, at least another 2 years, given what we've seen in the development process. And RTD is not going to be able to provide it. It's going to be incumbent upon us. If we're missing services, we have to find a way to provide those services. We've done that before by becoming a combined city and county. And we can do it again by finding some other way in which to provide those types of services. We'll really have to be creative. Won't be an easy task, but it's a task that's necessary. So that's where I'm at right now.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councilmember Lim.
I have questions first. Does any amount of redevelopment trigger either different off-street parking requirements, which would be reduced, or does redevelopment, any amount of redevelopment trigger bike parking, which would be increased?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Lim. I don't think that we've set a specific requirement. I'm looking at Mark Ambrosi is joining me this evening. He's our senior transportation planner. I don't think that we've specified. So similar to other code requirements, if a development is going through a new process in terms of a site development plan or is seeking to modify an urban renewal site plan or use-based special review, then they would need to comply with the current code. Because so many of these land use categories result in a reduction, it is conceivable that some developers may seek to amend their plans to then have to, to reduce the amount of parking that's needed for installation or to remove some from service to allow redevelopment, like was approved at the Walmart on 120th. Didn't proceed, but there was a reduction in parking there to allow a hotel.
I would think that's possible. It would seem more likely to me that somebody doesn't want to put in the more increased amount of bike parking that they weren't used to before at all.
Correct. The bicycle parking, because it's a new requirement, if a developer was proceeding through the process currently, the way we have approached a lot of our code amendments and that you'll be seeing in our draft ordinances is an effective date, either January 1st or a certain time frame in the future after the ordinance is approved to allow some time for plans that are moving through the process to be caught up to the current requirements. But those that are going through like a concept review right now, they would have to add that bicycle parking requirements. But a project that is just making a modification to their premises would not be required to add bicycle parking. And we can certainly work on adding code language to make sure that's very clear. We're doing that with the landscape ordinance. And we discussed that during a study session. So we can try to utilize some of that language in the same code way.
Okay. Do we have a ballpark on the cost of bike parking?
I don't have that this evening, but we can certainly bring that for first reading.
Okay, just curious. Okay, the significant reduction in the off-street parking for income-aligned housing. I understand you said that you're using the ITE guidelines and that. I just wonder how much that assumes that it's near transit. I mean, we would like to put our income-aligned housing near transit, but I'm looking at our income-aligned housing, a 1-bedroom gets 0.75 spaces. And I mean, in Broomfield, 2 teachers could be in income-aligned housing in a 1-bedroom, and they're going to different schools. They need 2 cars and they've got 0.75 spaces. That's what I'm trying to reconcile there.
And so we have had some recent projects that have come through that have done traffic analysis and shown that the income aligned properties do generate fewer parking needs or parking space needs as they're developed. And it's important to remember also that these are just the minimums. It could go up to 125% of that minimum. So there is a little bit of a range there, as well as if a project was an income aligned project that was located outside of a TOD and believed that it needed additional parking space, there is still the ability to either request a variance through the site development plan review process, or through this code amendment, there is the way to justify that through the parking analysis. And I'm not sure, Mark, if you have anything else to add in terms of the justification in the studies that we researched in terms of income aligned, the reduction.
Thank you, Anna. My name is Mark Ambrosi. I'm a senior transportation planner for the city and county of Broomfield and worked on this parking code. Just to add to what Anna said about the income aligned housing, there are 2 other local studies that were completed looking at affordable housing and the rates of vehicle ownership and oftentimes the empty parking spaces in existing lots. And so one of them was by RTD. It was focusing on station areas. So that's, that's kind of a different situation. The other one was completed by Fox Tuttle in 2020 or 2021. It is linked on the Broomfield Voice page for this project. And it found that basically 50% of income aligned housing parking spaces that use traditional parking requirements for like a multifamily residential, 50% of those parking spaces were unfilled. So through a number of studies and then also using the Institute for Transportation Engineers information, kind of combining that information, we made a recommendation that is in the updated parking code. And I will also mention that the recommendation we made is higher, requires more parking than these studies suggest we might actually need. So we tried to hedge a little bit with that. But we're certainly open to doing more exploration into those requirements to see if they're the right fit.
I mean, I know you have good interdepartmental communication. I guess I would feel, more secure about those reduced parking requirements if we had even some anecdotal evidence from our own housing alliance, or, that, yes, that makes sense to them, in Broomfield. I don't know. That's my thought. For the placement of the bike parking, and then this is a specific case in the off-street parking, when we're talking, this goes back to the EV charging. We've had some developments that have been large enough where I've thought about, should we have something in the code that says we encourage the bike parking or the EV parking to be dispersed in a large development? So I don't know if staff has ever considered that. I can see, the advantage, obviously, for EV parking in particular in a development is the electric conduit is all in one place. But if it's a large enough development, or for bike parking, it's actually advantageous for the residents or the customers to have it more dispersed.
Thank you for the question, Council Member. That's definitely something we can work towards. One of two ways. Well, there's probably multiple ways, but it can be a code requirement, although not really enforceable if it's worded in such a way that it's encouragement rather than it is required to be, and then a direction given. That's usually my preference when drafting code, is to have something that's fully enforceable, something very objective in the code. But through the site planning process that goes through development review, comes through a public process, that's another opportunity for us to look at the distribution and provide that feedback to the development community as well. And we can provide that early in the development review process. One of the future projects to be considered under our multi-year steps is design guidelines, community-wide, and that would be a fully appropriate item to be included in community-wide design guidelines.
Okay, that makes sense there. Some of the items where it said if there were a transit development management plan, that the parking spaces could be reduced. The one case in particular, it said the church could reduce its parking spaces if there were a TDM. I was having trouble figuring out what good would that do in a church, not unless you gave the people who came to the church every week parking space passes.
So Councilmember Lim, we've been going a little bit back and forth with how to approach the TDM at this point in time, since we are also participating in regional efforts around best practices. So the way that we were approaching it coming into the study session was to remove the references to the TDM. So there may have been a section of code where we left that in by accident. We believe that it's first important for us to work with our regional partners, come up with some best practices that we can then work into the code and really establish what we're going to expect as part of a transportation demand management plan. And then based on what's going to be in those plans and how those would apply to land uses, then we can do a better job at trying to match up what the reduction could be. Like you said, what would need to be in the TDM for a place of worship to be able to reduce those parking spaces. It's a little too early for us to tell until we have those additional steps with our regional partners.
Okay, that's good. Do we have any ballpark as to how many of our recently approved developments would have actually met the bike parking requirement as it's proposed?
Councilmember, I certainly don't have an exact number for you, but I think most of them would meet the short-term parking requirements. Very few would have met the long-term parking requirements. We have had more success in recent years having those incorporated, but certainly it's still the minority of projects.
Okay. And it still sticks in my head when I can't remember the development, but we had a developer say that they did not want to provide the first floor long-term bike parking because that they had experience in other developments in other areas where tenants didn't think it was safe and they preferred to keep the bikes in their own apartments. Did you consider any objection like that, or did you find that would be valid? I can't name the developer that said that, but I remember it wasn't that long ago.
I recall that as well. It was a multifamily development project, as you mentioned, that felt that there was appropriate space either within the units, in the garage spaces, or on their porches, patios, spaces that they could secure their own bicycle parking. And in their experience, they didn't have success with separate requirements. That is not what we were considering moving forward. We think that there are appropriate ways to do long-term parking for multifamily, and that is what we included in our code requirements.
Okay, thanks. Number one, yes. Number two, not for now. It can't be modified. I wish we had more transit that it could be. Number three, yes. Number four, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next is Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to follow up on what Councilmember Lynn was talking about in terms of income aligned residents, because there's quite a bit of research that says the key way out of poverty is to have a car. Lower income people tend to have more than one job, need to get to places, have extreme flexibility to get there. And I think Councilmember Ward mentioned sort of the elephant in the room. We would like there to be good transit in Broomfield, but I think it's fair to say there isn't. You can't get anywhere within Broomfield very easily on transit. So I am concerned that if we limit the amount of parking in lower income apartment multifamily, we are hurting the people we're trying to help in a way. I'm curious if you had similar, you mentioned studies that perhaps there's, from your research, there's too much parking now, and that what you're proposing wouldn't necessarily be a hardship. Does I interpret that correctly?
Yes, that's what the research suggests. And I should mention this research is primarily the two main studies that we were looking at were done in the Front Range of Colorado. So looking at communities in the Front Range, that is also supported by national studies and international studies suggesting that we have overparked income aligned housing.
Okay, thank you. I am curious whether at the studies, because it seems like just from anecdotally, there's way too much parking in the Walmart lot and never enough in the 7-Eleven, and varies. And I work in Denver where there is transit and not enough parking. And it's extremely difficult and it causes a great deal of problems. So I do think we need to be cautious about being too restrictive and in face of reality that we just don't have the transit to give people other options. Same on the lines to the bike safety. I would love for this to go hand in hand with bike routes It's one thing to provide more space for bikes, and I think we should, and I wish there was a way to require apartment developers to provide bike storage within their buildings. I've toured enough apartments with my daughter to know there usually isn't any space provided for a bike. But just saying, having more bike storage is great, but there's no place to bike safely necessarily in large parts of Broomfield. I certainly wouldn't bike on the street. And if we go this direction, I'd love to see it paired with some real actually safe biking routes on our streets. And finally, a question about the other communities you studied. Have they, I didn't see it in the memo, and if I missed it, I apologize, but have they adopted, or any of these cities adopted maximums and minimums in these overlays like you're proposing? And what their experiences have been, or what you gleaned from their experiences?
I would say that most communities that have updated their parking code within the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years have adopted parking maximums. I think City of Boulder, Longmont are two examples of communities nearby that have adopted parking maximums. Off the top of my head, I can't remember precisely the other communities that have adopted those. Again, that recommendation is based on best practices nationally for parking in general, just to limit the amount of overparked areas like the Walmart that was just mentioned.
The best practices from the industry overview, but not a lot of examples of cities that have actually implemented it.
I would have to get back to you about the exact number of those communities in this area that have adopted parking maximums. I know that a lot of communities are moving in that direction.
And I assume that's fairly recent that they've adopted these.
Yes.
So there's probably not a lot of evidence to gather from Longmont or Boulder as to the impact.
There is some evidence from Longmont. They did a recent, it was a discussion about parking, a workshop that they did, talking about how it has worked out well for them. But yeah, I have not heard about City of Boulder's success or lack thereof.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Is that all, Councilmember Cohen?
Mayor Pro Tem.
I am jumping in here. So we're going to go over the airwaves and call on Councilmember Marsh Holshin. Are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Sort of. You came out a little slow and robotic. Still.
Yeah. I heard y'all let me do remote tonight with Alexis being under the weather and running to and from kids from things on the car.
Councilmember Holshin, you're coming in super broken up.
Yeah.
Can you call back in via the
Can you-
phone maybe? I don't know.
Yes.
If it'll be,
Yeah, let me get to the place. And I'll go back.
okay. While he's doing that, I was next in line, so I'm going to ask a couple quick things and maybe he'll get back to us. So I'm going to start with saying that I really appreciate what, is being attempted here, and I certainly understand it, but the comments actually of Councilmember Cohen struck me. I liked his comments, and one thing he said was, try to be cautious about being too restrictive in the face of reality. And that's kind of really sums up where I am right now. I think particularly with the commercial, I think we all see it that, empty walnut parking lots and similar makes kind of sense. There seems to be way too much parking in certain areas of our community. Then on the other hand, I am cautious about the residential areas. I think I've both anecdotally, what I've seen and experienced myself, there's nothing more aggravating than trying to find a parking spot in your apartment complex and there's none available. So that's not to say that we aren't overparked. I don't have any information on that one way or another in Broomfield, but I would urge you to be very, cautious as to how much, we do reduce decks. We don't want to create situations where people can't park in their community and then they're forced to spill out into other neighboring communities. And I think we have seen that particularly in the trailer park community, I'm forgetting the name of it, on Midway.
Front Range.
Front Range community, right, which seems to be there's parking that goes on apparently in Willow Run across the street. And I'm not sure if that's because there's no parking spaces available or if they're just overzealous in their enforcement still. But either way, those are the concerns. I mean, you don't want to have residents that just can't find a parking spot. So, I mean, I'm going to trust you guys on this, that if our requirements are, too much and there's some reduction available, and great. But let's just, just make sure we don't overcorrect, I guess, and end up having communities where there's just no spaces for the, for the residents to park. For your first question, that the two-tiered approach, that does make sense to me. And then number two, the overlay areas. I do have one question on that. The Flatirons one, would that include the mall, or is that just the area along the 36 Bikeway?
Yes, that does include the mall.
Okay, so on that one, how would that impact? Because I would definitely not be in favor of, I mean, there seems to be a lot of, maybe there's a potential for reduction there. I don't know, but certainly the mall is a draw from, hopefully it's going to be a regional draw, right? I think it is, and hopefully it continues to be. And people are going to be driving to that. I mean, maybe some of them hopefully will be more and more taking the Bikeway and planning a Bikeway for shopping, maybe taking the 36 park and ride. But in general, people are going to be driving to the mall, right? So we want to make sure that people can find parking spots. Otherwise, they're going to be aggravated and they're going to go somewhere else.
Absolutely agree. I think we are doing some redevelopment within the mall to build some residential, or there are some plans in under development review currently to hopefully encourage more people to be able to walk around those areas.
I understand people are going to be going there. They're going to be, if they're shopping, they're going to want to be able to have some way to transport their goods. They're not going to be biking there. Most likely, if they're going to go for looking to actually a shop, they're not going to be walking there. Probably they're going to want somehow to transport it. It's going to be 95% of the time it's going to be in a car. So just be cognizant of that. At least I would suggest that. The long-term bicycle, I'm all in favor of the short-term bicycle, by the way. The long-term bicycle parking concerns me. A couple of reasons. I think one was the cost of it in residential, and I think you were going to look into that, you said. So I'd be interested to know how that's going to impact the building costs for developers in residential neighborhoods, particularly in the lower income communities that we're urging developers to build. So I would be interested to know if that will impact that, and if it does, how so. And then I do question, and maybe you can answer the need for long-term bicycle parking in any commercial area. I totally get the need for short-term parking. And I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I bike places, and it can be aggravating if there's not a place to park your bike. But I do question for businesses why they would need any overnight parking or indoor parking for bikes.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Just for clarification, retail centers and standalone commercial centers like that would not require long-term parking. But some of the uses, like a hospital or office uses, we are proposing long-term parking, not just for those visiting, but also for their employees.
Again,
So more than 2 hours.
Right. So if it's, an outdoor space, and not a bad idea if it's covered. I mean, you have a spots if someone's visiting or working for the day. Makes sense. I guess what I question is the need for indoor parking overnight or for multiple days for any business. I mean, I'm just not sure that, and maybe there's anecdotal, I don't know if there are places that do have it and whether it's being used or not. Maybe it is, and it's a great idea. I don't know, but I guess I'd be interested in, if you don't know that answer, I'd be interested in finding that out. Is it actually used in places that have it?
So I think it's based on the way that we were defining the long-term parking was anything more than 2 hours. So that would cover employees that are working at a facility for part-time or full-time hours, 6 to 8 hours a day, may want somewhere more secure for their bicycle rather than an outdoor space. But we can certainly look at those uses again, dig a little bit more into the research and make sure that when we bring this forward, if directed
Okay.
by council, that we've got that research behind it for you.
Okay, I appreciate that. I have nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. James, are you back? Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
I appreciate you all letting me do remote. With Alexis being out of commission right now, I was picking up Virginia from softball, so that was my car. So, I just wanted to kind of echo Councilmember Ward's comments earlier. I know this is a chicken and egg kind of thing sometimes with the development and transit, but ultimately, I believe that we should be moving away from parking minimums altogether in favor of parking maximums. We have been for too long a car-centric culture, and that needs to, we need the density to go away from that. And I think this parking requirements helps that. I can't see myself voting for some new development that's not dense in the future. So I think this goes along with that well. I don't have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to kind of go off the feedback is all I really had tonight. I do support the two-tiered approach, even though I would like to see parking minimums done away with citywide, honestly, because we do need the density. I support the TOD overlay areas. I do support the use of parking maximums, and I do support the bike parking. I think they should be more than they are. I think we should go even greater amount, but go forward as we can. So ultimately, I think like I said, I think we need to build for the future, and that requires dense development and doing away with giant open parking lots that are full of empty spots. So it's kind of my feedback. So thank you, Mayor.
Did you want to do the 4 questions for direction for staff?
I thought I did.
Yep, you did. Okay. Councilmember Delgadillo.
Thank you, Mayor. I also don't have any questions. I just have the answers to the questions. I'm okay with the 2-tiered approach. Like a couple of my colleagues before me, I am strongly supportive of moving towards a parking maximum system instead of parking minimums. As someone who's lived in a multifamily housing for the past 3 years, I think we are way over parked. It is kind of ridiculous how many spots are open, in my personal opinion. Second, yeah, sure. I think the areas are perfectly acceptable. 3, yep, big time in favor of parking maximums. And then 4, yes, very much in favor of having extensive long-term and short-term bike parking. I mean, I can say personally, as someone who, again, lives in a multifamily housing and has done so for the past 3 years, it would be really nice not to have to take your bike inside. We are lucky enough to live on the 1st floor. However, there are people who live on the 4th floors and would have to drag their bike up and down, go through the elevator, take up space, do all that stuff. And it's much more convenient to have long-term storage. Short-term biking, I mean, I remember when Councilmember Ward came over to my apartment at one point and had to take his bike into my unit because we did not have any short-term parking available. And you are not allowed to park lock up your bike on a fence or anything like that. So, I mean, it's terribly inconvenient. It's really disruptive for the people who live there. So yes, certainly short-term and long-term bike parking is a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
You. I do have a couple questions. One of them is okay, why would a 3+ bedroom apartment have more parking than a 3+ bedroom house? Because homes are like 2 spots, and then when you get to 3+, it's like a additional half per bedroom. Like, why would you anticipate there being more people there? Or is that related to the garage?
Council member, some of the research that we did, we didn't really dive in to try and find the reasoning behind it. But it's just based on the generation of what the parking studies were showing us as appropriate based on the usage.
Okay, that was only one question there. And then on the schools, and I'm not on that page anymore. Do we only do private schools and not public schools because public schools are exempt?
Correct.
Yeah.
Based on state law, we do not do any of the regulation of the parking lots for a public school.
And then under the private schools, and this is probably, it's getting nitpicky because we may not ever have this scenario, but there was an example, I don't have the numbers right here, but it was like one space per every 3 students of parking. And would that not just apply to juniors and seniors in high school? Or what was the reasoning of the extra spaces like an elementary school?
Mark, do you have that information? Otherwise, we can look into that and bring it back. Yeah, we'll have to look into that and bring it back.
Yeah, maybe I'm misreading it, but that'd be interesting to know. Like I would definitely just, I have high school kids, a couple of them are driving. And you really only need cars for those. Those kids rely heavily on the cars. I know you want to transition to bikes, but they rely heavily on the cars. The parking lot's full, but it wouldn't be for anyone up to, it's only 11th and 12th graders. Okay, so that was the other question. And then I also found that interesting on the income aligned multifamily housing. And if that's what the data shows, we're relying on it, I'm fine with that, but that was an interesting piece that I saw, that it seemed like there should be as much parking as regular apartments. And then on the, put the other question here. Find the, and then on the long-term bicycle storage areas, it says it must be well lit, secure, and I recommend to have security cameras. And what does the word secure mean? Because I think I'm kind of going like along the lines of our Mayor Pro Tem, like how much money are you really going to put into this bike parking to create it to be secure in some of these situations where there's not a ton of riding bikes?
Councilmember, thank you for the question. I think we're still refining some of those sections of the code. We would expect this to be refined quite a bit before we bring it back in an ordinance form. And that's a good example where we really need to dive in and make sure that we have definitions for all of the terms that we're using. So it's very clear.
Okay,
Yes.
and then piece of that would be how cumbersome are we making this to the those might not be. I can see in the apartments it's going to be used a lot more than some of the businesses. And then under on number 6 at the very end there, under the bike requirements, the workplaces with more than 100 employees must provide showers and lockers for employees. Is that standard? Are we asking for something that goes way beyond, or is that standard and easily added to the bathroom? Like, is that like, I'm just wondering if that's also cumbersome or if that's kind of standard practice.
I think this also gets back to one of the earlier questions in terms of costs and impacts from these types of development. We'll dive a little bit into that. Bicycle parking requirements are not as common. And of the bicycle parking requirements, those long-term requirements are still less common. So is it standard? No, I wouldn't say it's standard across the development community. These are more restrictive than they could be in many municipalities, but we will bring that information in terms of the impact on costs when this comes back forward.
Okay, and then answering the questions, I would say yes to the first 2, and then the third one, yes, relying on the data, and the same thing with the fourth one. As you refine this, just making sure it's not too cumbersome, then yes.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councilmember Leslie.
Yes, 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 yes.
Thank you very much for your succinct answer. I think this is all great, but I do have concerns about 2. The TOD overlay areas on the map. As you see on Highway 7, if we can put that map up again, it's a transit-oriented development final. Yeah, that one. See where it says proposed? I've been here for a while and it's been proposed for a while. So I worry because if we classify this as TOD, then the state might want to come in and force us to rezone it at super high density like they did this last year. And yet we don't have the transit. So all these folks that are living in this growing dense area still have to have cars. There is no other way to get to the grocery. Actually, there's no other way to get to the grocery in Arista. You have to drive your car, and that's our only urban walkable community, but there's no grocery. And then when you talk about families with kids, they need cars too. The single mother can't be riding her bike with bags of groceries and kids. So we have to look at the larger picture that there are lots of people in different stages of their lives and all types of housing. And I just, we live in a suburb. It was not created to be walkable, and it's not. So we have to face facts. We're not this mythical urban center yet. We're trying to get there, but according to DRCOG in 2020, we need to invest an additional 36 billion in transit by 2050 to even reduce our vehicle miles traveled by 2%. And we all know none of that's going to happen. There's no money for this. So until things drastically change with the budget and how we fund transportation, I just think when I see future and I see proposed, I don't think we're any closer to getting public transit on Highway 7 than we were 6 years ago when I started in the Highway 7 meetings. And Councilmember Anderson, you're on that board now. Do you feel any more optimistic that we're going to get that transit in anytime soon?
Supposed to answer that?
Yes, please.
No, I don't. The mobility hub, yes, that's actually coming. That's planned. That's much further along, but that doesn't say proposed either, does it? But no, not that, no guarantees on that future station, but we're hopeful and continue to move towards it.
Thank
But no
you.
guarantees.
So that's my concern, is if we label it a TOD and it doesn't have the T, are they gonna make us, they're gonna commandeer it? You know what I'm saying? Word to the wise. All right. Any other questions for the good of the cause? Anybody want second round? All right. Thank you, Ms. Burton. Oh, yeah, Councilmember Anderson.
I just want to second what the mayor just said.
Oh.
So thank you. Your whole comment.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Our next agenda item this evening is a study session and request for direction related to potential building code requirements regarding fire sprinkler systems for single-family duplexes and townhomes, and an update regarding the wildland urban interface WUI code requirements. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Yes, thank you. And Ms. Burton Zeddy is fixed at that podium. Please walk us through this next item.
Thank you. Good evening again, Mayor Pro Tem, City Council. If I could have the next slide, please. So this study session item is actually discussing two topics this evening that involve potential updates to building codes for Broomfield. The first topic came up this year when we were considering the 2021 code package back in February. At that time, the 2021 code package, which includes the 2021 International Residential Code, included a local amendment to allow townhomes, single-family homes, and paired homes to be built without fire sprinkler systems. Broomfield has had this local amendment in place since the requirement for fire sprinkler systems for these unit types was first included in the International Residential Code back in 2009. Staff evaluated the factors at that time in February that were originally used to justify that local amendment and determined it would be appropriate to bring back a discussion for City Council regarding the fire sprinkler systems. And again, this is on new single-family paired homes and townhomes. Next slide, please. When initially considering the local amendment, a number of factors were considered by Broomfield. So this was way back at the adoption of the 2009 residential code. These included the cost of sprinkler systems, but there is a potential savings for homeowners. We estimated that based on our research around $160 to $175 per year for having a sprinkler system within their home, but there are costs up front. And those costs for new construction ranged in our estimate around $5,800 up to $8,700 for a single family home that's between 2,000 and 3,000 square feet. There's additional costs that could be incurred for developments if they are being constructed. The new home is being constructed on lots that did not anticipate adding fire sprinklers and therefore have only a 3/4 inch water tap instead of a 1 inch. So those additional costs could range between $4,000 and $5,000 because it includes a water pump and additional storage tank on the property. The second factor that was considered previously in Broomfield was the necessity to contract with a fire sprinkler system contract. And this is actually also related to the third bullet. But Baseline and other communities within Broomfield have been successfully finding local fire sprinkler system companies to do the installation work because these communities already require fire sprinklers in Broomfield. And as I said, related to that is the third bullet. There is a limited availability, or was at the time, of plumbing contractors that then necessitated hiring a separate fire sprinkler contractor. This seems to be still an issue. Broomfield staff only found 2 plumbing contractors that were certified to install fire sprinkler systems. So again, most of the new homes would have to contract with a specific fire sprinkler contractor for the installation. And then the fourth bullet was the potential impacts for staff time. But based on the fact that staff from both Broomfield and North Metro have been working with developers that are installing residential fire sprinkler systems, we no longer consider this an issue for either of our staffs. And we believe that we can accomplish any new reviews that are necessary to implement fire sprinkler systems for these units. Next slide, please. Some, but certainly not all, local communities have enforced the residential fire sprinkler system requirements. I've got a few listed on the screen, and these are also in the staff memorandum. One of note is Lafayette, which requires fire sprinkler systems, but exempts accessory dwelling units if the primary home does not already have a fire sprinkler system. And they also exempt subdivisions if the water taps were already installed and do not support the fire sprinkler system. So again, those would be communities largely with a 3/4 inch tap rather than a 1 inch. They also exempt short-term rentals, but based on Broomfield's existing requirements related to short-term rentals, it would not be necessary to exempt converting a home to a short-term rental because we have some existing restrictions in place regarding short-term rentals. Next slide, please. Then the second item for discussion this evening is regarding the WUI codes, the Wildland Urban Interface codes. WUI codes, as we like to call them, are designed to mitigate the risk from wildfire for both life and property. They're applicable typically in areas that are determined to be of higher risk for wildfire. At the time of the 2021 code adoption earlier this year, staff referenced bringing back this future discussion on the WUI code. At that time, we were expecting discussion regarding WUI codes to occur at a state level, and this did occur with State Bill 23-166, which created a wildfire resiliency code board. This code board will be very similar to the energy code board that was previously established and created a model energy code. Similarly, this board will function to create a model WUI code that would be applicable to cities throughout the state, cities and counties throughout the state. Broomfield and all other cities and counties would then need to take this model code and adopt it after it's finalized in 2025. Although we don't know yet what the code board will be utilizing to determine the applicability of their WUI model code, we are expecting probably around 10 or less % of Broomfield would likely require compliance with the model code requirements, those new WUI code requirements. Some of those areas include developed areas like Skystone and Anthem Ranch, so those areas have already been developed, or they might be areas that are currently under construction like Sims Technology Park, which is just north of Skystone. Staff is recommending that the adoption of a WUI code for Broomfield wait until the adoption of the model, the state model energy. Too many times I've said state model energy code. The state model WUI code is finalized in July of 2025. In the interim, Broomfield staff and North Metro can meet and develop interim guidelines on things like fence materials, landscape guidelines, fire breaks that could be made available to residents as guidelines or potentially even incorporated into regulations as an interim measure before the consideration of the state model WUI code. I will also mention that we had some correspondence received this evening related to tonight's item, but it was in relation to wood burning. And I wanted to point out that tonight's discussion about the WUI is, and WUI codes are only applicable to areas that are determined to be at higher risk. So if the wood burning restrictions were incorporated into the WUI code, they would only be applicable to the WUI areas of Brimfield, so 10% or less of Brimfield. So if that is not the intent of the discussion, a separate discussion may be needed in the future about whether there's interest in either banning open burning or modifying the existing permit burning requirements. And I'll mention that North Metro Fire Rescue has a representative here this evening who can answer questions specific to open burning, wood burning. Next slide, please. So following our standard process, we have set up multiple ways to try and engage the development community to let them know that the City Council is considering updates to building code requirements. We held a community meeting last week. It was attended by a few builders, and we included meeting notes for that meeting in the correspondence file since it occurred after finalization of the memo. We also received some letters from the Home Builders Association and Brightland Homes. These letters identified concerns regarding the increased costs associated with fire sprinkler systems and whether there is a desire for fire sprinkler system improvements in new homes. Brightland also referenced the increased costs and loss of usable floor space for homes that need to have a pump and additional water storage tanks because they have 3/4 inch taps installed in the community. So for those communities that are building new homes but already have their infrastructure. And North Metro Fire Rescue also provided a letter both in support of the proposed fire sprinkler systems as well as a response to the Home Builder Association's letter. So those can be found in the correspondence folder. So in addition to the community meeting that we had and receiving communications regarding the proposal, staff has also sent emails out to our builders to let them know about the proposed change. There's a notice on our website and there is a Brimfield Voice hearing page. And of course, there will be public hearings for any proposed code amendments. Next slide, please. At the conclusion of tonight's meeting, staff is seeking input on both of these topics, the WUI code as well as fire sprinkler systems for single-family paired homes and townhomes. The first question on the screen is related to whether or not to move forward with requirement for fire sprinkler systems for those single-family townhomes and paired homes. And I further added a sub question tonight that was not in the memorandum, but is based on the letter we received from Brightland Homes, specifically whether there is an interest in exempting certain conditions such as was done with Lafayette, similar to they have accessory dwelling units, as well as the subdivisions that already have infrastructure installed that would not support fire sprinkler systems. Then the second question this evening is in relation to whether there is City Council support for a plan to bring back a study session in 2025 to discuss the model code after it's been finalized by the state. And in the interim, staff working with North Metro to potentially have some guidelines for future development and modification for new development and significant modifications to existing development that may be located within what could be determined to be WUI areas of Brimfield. And at this time, I would also like to clarify for the record that Brimfield doesn't have a formal WUI designated area. That would be part of that process of working with North Metro to establish which areas are established. We did include some information in the memorandum that would be some of the basis of establishing where fire risk areas would be located. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burton-Zetti. We will now go to council member questions, starting with Council Member Ward again.
Thank you, Mayor. I will start off first with the the WUI code. I'm supportive of having us postpone it and bring it back for a study session in 2025 once the state board has adopted their model code. As it relates to the fire sprinkler systems in single family townhomes and paired homes, I have a couple questions. Can you go over how common is it for like multifamily units to have fire suppression systems such as a sprinkler system? I know my building in particular has it, but that's anecdotally.
I'm joined this evening by Tim Pate, Chief Building Official.
Good evening, thanks. I'm Tim Pate, the Chief Building Official. I can answer that question. In the current International Building Code, that's where multifamily projects are designed and built under, and it's a requirement that all multifamily projects have a fire sprinkler system. So this discussion tonight is just for structures built under the International Residential Code.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that multifamily was, we had to have that in those systems. So then my next question goes kind of along the lines of the letter that the Home Builders Association sent us. They mention, the law, this goes to the sub bullet point for the exemptions. What properties in Broomfield would that particular exemption fall under? Obviously, this is going to be for future developments and not ones that already are building.
So, Councilmember Ward, the way that it was worded for Lafayette was that the infrastructure and water tap had to already be in place. So those would be subdivisions that are already underway. Single family, paired homes and townhomes, we actually don't have a whole lot of them going forward. A lot of our new residential development is in multifamily. But we do have Brightland Homes, which is Dillon Point. All of their infrastructure was already installed. And that was why they were sharing. There would definitely be a cost impact there, as well as very important to them was the floor area loss, because they would have to modify their floor plans to accommodate a large storage tank. The other communities that we have that are moving forward significantly would be Baseline, which already requires fire sprinkler systems. So a lot of the developments like Prospector subdivision in like the Wilcox area, some of those already have their water taps installed. And so it would be applicable to them, but it would be a far fewer subset if it was specific, such as how Lafayette did it, where the infrastructure has to already be installed.
Okay, thank you. For me, I would rather require it, to be quite honest, especially since North Metro Fire put in a letter of support. I think it's particularly helpful for townhomes and paired homes, since they do share a wall. I know the Home Builders Association mentioned that they use different materials that supposedly, according to them, slow the process of moving from home to home. But I think this would be just a secondary safeguard, honestly. And about the exemption, like what Lafayette did, I'm gonna have to come back to that one. I need to think on it for just a few more minutes.
Thank you. Then we'll go on to Councilmember Anderson.
All right, thank you. I have a question. I don't think this was in the memo, but was there any consideration for remodels on that, on adding the sprinkler system? The actual remodels or anything?
There was not. The way that the code would be written would be new residential construction.
Okay, so I take care away from the concern of adding the tank to those homes. Okay, and I am definitely in support of at the fire sprinkler systems, adding that to the new builds, but I would be interested in that consideration for the additional cost of that tank and exploring that just a little bit more. I'm not sure on that one, if we should exempt it for the 3/4 inch. That's not really helpful, but I think in a way we'd want to move forward with all of them. And then on the WUI code, I'm absolutely in support of waiting till October 2025. And the reasoning is because for Ward 4, it's just Anthem Ranch. The western side is the area that's likely going to be considered. And our staff has already done their diligence and already, met with the Anthem Ranch residents and the board, and added in that mowed strip, worked with the residents on the vegetation and the board of the watering. So it's like so much of it's already in place. So I'm fine because where we're at, waiting until 2025. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. And Councilmember Cohen, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't lean towards supporting the fire sprinkler system because my understanding is, one is the significant cost that it would place on homes. But I understand the reasoning we have smoke alarms in homes and sprinklers in hotels is that, fire alarms are set off by smoke rather quickly. Sprinkler systems are set off by heat. And so there's much more of a delay. Moreover, when a fire alarm goes off, you can exit a house very quickly. If it goes off in a hotel, it takes longer to get out. And thus the sprinkler system is an extra level of protection to protect people as they get out of a multi-story building. Just the time to escape a building. Is that correct? Is that the correct reasoning for why we do it that way?
Thank you. Generally speaking, the residential fire sprinkler system is for protection of life, as you're mentioning. So providing additional opportunity time for someone to safely exit the structure.
But the reason we don't necessarily require it in a single family home is that you can generally get out of that home a lot quicker after a smoke alarm goes off. You're close to the door, you're on one floor, the second, whereas people in a hotel or a large building may need to take stairs, be many floors, or, just to get out of the building.
If it would be acceptable, I could invite David Waller with North Metro Fire Rescue District. They joined us this evening and he could provide some additional information.
Good evening. My name is David Waller. I'm a Broomfield resident and I'm the Deputy Fire Marshal at North Metro Fire. I'd say that the largest reason that the folks that write the model codes added fire sprinkler systems in single family townhomes and paired homes back in 2009. There's a recognition in our industry that if you think back to when I was a little kid running around in my grandparents' house, their furniture, which is what people in my world think of as the fuel for the fire, was made of wood, cotton, wool. Flashover, which is the point in a compartment where everything, it gets so hot in that compartment, the fire has grown large enough that everything in that compartment room has gotten hot enough that everything suddenly catches on fire. That's flashover by a quick definition. Back in those days when I was a little kid, flashover typically took 20, 30 minutes. That was well within the response time of the fire department. Over that time frame, we've had two things happen. Furniture is no longer made of wool and cotton. It's made of poly, you name it, polyethylene, poly something else, poly that, still some wood in there, arguably, but that poly, whatever, is effectively gasoline in terms of its burning characteristics. At the same time, the other thing that's happened is the type of structures that we're talking about are more and more and more being built out of lightweight construction. So what used to be 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, 2x12s, solid lumber is now I-beams, I-joists, and that kind of thing made out of, simply put, particle board or oriented strand board. And it's not a true 2x anymore. It's a really thin structural I-beam, if you will, out of wood. That stuff doesn't last as long in fire. So you take the fact that flashover is happening now with the modern furniture that we have, a whole lot of plastic and poly, you guessed it. Flashover is happening in 4 minutes or less. If you've been to any of our fire sprinkler demonstrations at National Night Out the last few years, you've seen that live. So arguably, flashover happening within 4 minutes is not within our response time. It's certainly not within the response time of assembling the amount of personnel and apparatus that we require before we enter a structure. So the folks that write the model building codes, the IBC, the IRC in this case is what we're talking about, recognize that over a decade ago and have started and require or added into those codes fire sprinkler systems for the type of buildings that we're talking about tonight.
And is it correct, though, that the sprinklers are not set off by smoke? There has to be intense heat. Is that what triggers?
Well, that's correct. Just like in this building, each individual fire sprinkler is going to activate with heat. So yes, the smoke alarm is going to go off within 30, 45 seconds, depending on the type of fire and intensity. The fire sprinkler is probably going to be maybe 30 seconds to a minute later than that. But the point is the sprinkler goes off, it's going to control that fire right away. It may not extinguish it, but it's going to put it out right away, or excuse me, control it right away. So these systems are intended, as Ms. Burton-Dezzetti said, as life safety systems. They're not intended to protect the structure, but when the fire is effectively controlled to the couch or the waste paper basket or whatever, the stove where the fire began, that's the goal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. So I want to go back to the question just to clarify. I think it's Councilmember Anderson asked, this was my biggest concern, is that in any existing structures, this would not be applicable. And if it is applicable, what would that, if I understand that what you said, that it would not be applicable for any existing structures. Is that true?
Correct. That I can't think of an instance where it would be applicable. It would have to be a complete new construction. So if someone was scraping their house and reconstructing on a brand new house, that would be applicable. And even with like the town of Lafayette had the requirement that if you changed from a single family to a short-term rental, they exempted it out, that change in use. But the way that we regulate short-term rentals, there's so many restrictions that it doesn't change that occupancy for us. And so that would be the only way that it would have been required, but based on our occupancy or our short-term rental requirements, it even wouldn't be required there.
Okay.
So I can't think of an instance where an
So
existing structure would be modified.
for the time being, it sounds like that if you have a home, this is not going to be applicable at some point, if and when we get to the gentrification of Boulder or something, where older homes are being scraped and then rebuilt. I suspect that's when this would then come into play for those.
Correct. Or for a fully detached accessory dwelling unit, if that is not exempted out. That could potentially be something where it would be applicable. We'd have to look into that.
Okay. So for multifamily, I get the arguments, particularly when you're sharing walls or roofs. I am very skeptical on requiring this in single family homes. My first thought when I saw this was, what is the need here that we're trying to protect, people from? I'm not aware of many, and maybe this is to our fire representative, if I get your name, sir. But how many interior fires do we have in Broomfield? How big of an issue is this? I don't hear about this very often. So I just don't know. I guess I'm skeptical of the need, particularly for single family homes. So is there, how many fires do we have in Broomfield a year?
I apologize. I don't have that number off the top of my head. It's certainly not hundreds,
Okay.
but arguably Broomfield is a relatively newly built community. It's easy to say that it's just a matter of time. You know, when we look at new developments, we talk about from the fire district perspective, needing to worry about this for 50 to 100 years. So it's hard to say that things will stay the same. I don't have that statistic for you. I mean, it's not 100.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and I suspect it's much lower than that even. I have seen your demonstrations. I do appreciate those, and I'm not saying it's not a great idea or not even a good idea for folks to do this. You know, put it in their homes. I just have a hard time mandating anyone to do something, and I think it's a sort of a risk benefit analysis for an individual in my mind, particularly for single family homes. That could be sold on the townhomes or the paired homes, but I don't, at least at the moment, I'm not convinced that there's a need for this for single family homes. I think it's a very limited situation. If an owner of a new build or a scrape wants this in their home, that's great. Go ahead and spend the money, but I see a hard time requiring folks to have this in their homes if it's what seems to be a relatively low risk at this point. So that's where I am with that. And I'm okay with your second question. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
I fully support this, the fire sprinklers. I appreciate Deputy Chief Waller's remarks that were very specific as to why our newer homes in particular need this, single family homes need this. I really appreciated North Metro taking time to write a letter of support and doing the rebuttal letter to the home builders. That was super. So we're not only, the letters pointed out that we're not only trying to protect the safety of the homeowners in the single family houses, but we're also protecting the firefighters to a greater degree. I appreciate that. The North Metro rebuttal pointed out that the homeowners association overestimated the cost of the new construction per square foot for the sprinkler system. And that was based on their experience in the baseline. And the letter pointed out that also based on North Metro's experience, that there should not be any delays in permitting, processing, or anything because of trying to find fire sprinkler contractors, that North Metro is confident that they will be able to be found. So I fully support these fire sprinklers in single family homes, townhomes, and paired homes. I would be willing to consider the exemption for ADUs when paired with homes that don't have the fire sprinkler systems. I need more information about, staff kind of sketched out where this would be applicable for the subdivisions with existing water taps. I think I'd want to see a little more detail on that before I decided on that. Would that be possible?
Sure, we could certainly come up with a list before first reading, and I will mention, because I would remiss to not include them since they attended our meeting, but Meritage Homes, which is building in the Via Vara area, it would also be applicable there. Their infrastructure is in any of the non-sprinklered units for the Century developer who is in Interlaken, and then Brightland Homes would be probably the three largest projects, but we can certainly find any of the smaller projects that are also, it would also be applicable for if we brought this forward for first reading.
Okay, thank you. My tendency on that is to say, I want it to apply to the subdivisions with existing water taps installed too. It's my tendency, but I'd like to see the list. On the WUI code, yes, I agree that it should wait to be brought back until the second quarter of 2025, even though I testified for the statewide bill and take that WUI code board's work very seriously, but I understand it's very technical and it will need some staff implementation time, and it would be better for the experts at the state level to work that out. I understand that. The definition of the WUI area locally. So you pointed to Anthem Ranch, Skystone, and Sims. Now, I looked at the orange area on the map. What's that? The wildfire risk map that has the overlay. And I had thought it does pertain to the edge of Wildgrass too, like in on Lantana and Silver Feather. And so that wasn't mentioned. Maybe you still had it in mind, but I just, since it's where I live, I want to make sure that that's not overlooked, that is it's at the same level of orange as like Anthem Ranch and that.
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. Yes, there were additional areas. I was just highlighting some of the larger areas that I know the discussion has come up recently regarding fire safety. But yes, there are other areas. I think there's also areas along 287 and along a lot of perimeter areas near the open space, portions of North Park, and also reaching up further to the north near the north edges of Palisade. I believe also we're shown about 10% of Brimfield, a little less than that. We're in those orange areas, and we did include a link to that map. So if anyone's interested, there is a link to it.
Okay. And I do appreciate that staff said they will continue to work with North Metro on reaching out to the particular areas that will most likely be identified in the WUI area as far as fence materials and landscaping guidelines and fire break plans. I mean, a lot of Ward 3 rims, this open space, we had comments from Country Estates, Lackamora, Outlook. The Outlook HOA was writing specifically as a organization concerned with what they should do as a result of being awakened by the Marshall Fire. So I appreciate that whatever we can do in the meantime to mitigate the wildfire risk, we can do until the state board comes forward with that code. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Degladieu.
Thank you, Mayor. I am in support of all of this. I think it is very reasonable to have the sprinkler requirement, especially for the townhomes. As someone who is closing on a townhouse, it is very reassuring to think that in the future, probably not for me, but in the future, these regulations will be in place. I'm okay with an ADU exemption or exploring other exemptions. In general, I'd want to be a little bit circumspect about it, but I'm okay with it. And then, yes, coming back for more guidance on the WUI code will be very helpful in October 2025. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't see Councilmember Marshall. Anything to add?
Yes, ma'am, my hand's up.
Okay. Go ahead.
Quick question. So a lifetime ago, I owned a restaurant, and we had to have our fire suppression system, updated and inspected every year. What's the maintenance requirements on these residential systems? What's the estimated cost of that? And do we have an estimated cost savings on homeowners insurance for people who have these?
Thank you for the question, Council Member. Yes, we have the cost savings estimated around 100. I think we had $160, $175 a year annually for potentially the cost savings on your homeowners insurance. There is regular maintenance required for a home sprinkler system. I'm going to look to my two experts and see if they have information how frequently or potential costs. Rock, paper, scissors, maybe. There we go.
Fire sprinkler systems intended for these properties that we're talking about are specifically designed and intended for the lower maintenance that you would expect. I honestly don't have that info off the top of my head. if I did, something else that I need to know would spill out and I'd forget that. So, we can come back with that in or find a way, an avenue to get you that information. But it's certainly not like, this building has very specific requirements for annual, every 5 years, every 10 years, that kind of thing, specific testing and maintenance that needs to happen. For single family homes, I don't have the answer for you, but it's not going to be anywhere near as rigorous.
Do we anticipate the cost of the maintenance to be less than what you'd save in homeowners insurance?
Yeah, I would think so. That would be. But I don't know.
Okay. Those were my only questions. I obviously do concern about the cost of new construction. I looked over the homeowners or home builders letter, and I do appreciate the North Metro Fire, the rebuttal letter. I do support this right now. I do think that it is worth the cost for new builds to have the extra protection and the loss of life that could come from a fire. So I support moving forward with this. And as far as the Lafayette exemption, would want more information on that, but I'm willing to consider that as well. And as for the WUI codes, I support moving forward with those, at the time that the state finalizes their information. So that's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a kind of a different perspective here, I guess, a little bit. One is, I think single-family homeowners should be as well protected as our neighbors who are in rental units or in other kinds of housing units. And it just bothers me a little bit to think that we'll say you don't have to have that same level of safety, but we're going to have it for other people. I think we need to be thinking about safety for everybody. Number two, there may not be a lot of savings beyond what you already get if you're located near a fire hydrant. Yeah. I mean, those things kind of all have an effect on your homeowner's insurance. But we often forget about all the other losses. It's not just in the poly furniture that we all know, but it's in those special things that you've invested in that maybe are more nostalgic than anything else. But certainly all homeowners have properties and things they've inherited and special pieces in their family tradition that they now have residing with them that potentially could be protected with the sprinkler system that would certainly go up in smoke without it. And I think we forget about that. So we think only about the cost side of things, and we don't necessarily think about the other kinds of costs, life or property or things that are important to us as a family and the traditions of that family. So I support this initiative. I do think it's important that we think about protecting everybody. In terms of the WUI, I'm supportive of waiting, and letting that develop. And as Councilmember Anderson said, certainly in our community, certainly Anthem Ranch has already done a lot of work in this area after the Marshall Fire. I'd be interested, I don't know, Chief, now that they've come to some determination about the causality of the Marshall Fire, and even though people acted appropriately, but the burn that was done and was buried and then came back is pretty typical. And I'm wondering if that may lead to some different kinds of codes about outdoor burning, which probably should be stopped anyway because of the environmental issues. I don't expect you to answer that tonight, but I would think that would have further implications for the kind of codes that we may want to be thinking about here in Broomfield. So I just, city manager, just kind of put that, out there, because people acted appropriately. They did what they thought they had to do, and yet it created a terrible inferno. Not by fault specifically, but because probably that practice is outdated anyway, burying hot coal. I mean, we know in Boy Scouts, we were taught, don't just Girl Scouts too, I'm sure. Don't just bury the fire, because it could come back. So anyway, I don't mean to be proselytizing here tonight. So I do support letting that process develop itself. But I do think the sprinkler system approach is important for future development of all kinds. So that's where I support that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, you know, I agree with all of the different aspects of this. It's a little bit of a competing priority with health and safety and also income aligned housing, right? If this becomes cost prohibitive to folks that are trying to invest in a home. But I think in the end, you know, the health and safety always comes first. And I appreciate everybody's thoughts on that. Yes, Councilmember Leslie.
You know, just think, I know I'll be criticized because the criticisms have already been out there towards other municipalities, particularly Superior and Louisville, in terms of their change in codes right around the time of the Marshall Fire, and certainly will be criticized for increasing the cost of housing of all kinds at a time when we're trying to, quote, make housing more affordable. Yet again, I think there are other implications that we forget about, that we don't think. Did I say that? Forget about it. When New York's coming out, I'm sorry. It's a family thing. Yeah. And I think we need to fight back on that. I think we need to not let those who would argue that we're being irresponsible by adding more cost to the housing at a time, particularly here, not just here in Colorado, but literally across the globe, when fires are becoming a enormously problematic issue because of climate change and things. So I really think that we need to take life and property more seriously. And I think these codes would be very important for us to support. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. And we'll go to second round now with Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had two quick questions. One that came to mind as we were talking about the home builders. They mentioned in their letter that there aren't enough qualified individuals to do the testing, if I remember correctly from that letter. How does this testing and the certification differ for those in multifamily units? Because we have a lot of those, they're newer, they tend to have those features and they have to do testing. I've been through a few of those. Those are always fun. Guess I've stumped them.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I didn't catch that one reference in the HBA letter, but what they would be referring to, I would suspect it's more in line with possibly the question on the maintenance issue, which we're going to try to get a little more information for you, the council, because going through the inspection process for a single family residential fire sprinkler, we do the inspections along with North Metro, and then we certify it, and then we do the certificate of occupancy. So after that, I think that might be, I'm not sure, there's not a special testing company that I'm aware of that a home builder has to get. So
Okay. Did I miss that?
I know that's
in-
probably not a great
Am I just
answer.
making that up or did someone else in that letter actually
I did
find
read
that?
Somewhere.
I don't want to be making stuff up on the dais.
No, I'm sure we have, but I'm sorry, that wasn't probably a 100% answer.
No.
You have an answer.
There was something in the letter about the number of available installers. So just like there's an electrician, just like there's an HVAC subcontractor. When you read their letter, it's probably important to note that there's, for these properties that we're talking about, there's really two types or two ways to provide the fire sprinkler system, protection that we're talking about. One is a system where the sprinklers are attached to and fed by the exact same piping that's being used for the sinks, the toilets, the washers, all that domestic water. And that's the kind of system that's installed by a plumber, not a fire sprinkler contractor. And so what they put in their letter is probably fair, that there are not very many plumbing companies or plumbers that have gotten the certification and taken on the liability insurance to install those types of systems. Those types of systems are perfectly legitimate from our perspective in providing the level of safety we're looking for, or is what the code is looking for. The other type of system is what's called the NFPA 13D. That's the name of the standard. And those systems are installed by actual fire sprinkler installation companies, just like the one in this building, just like one in an apartment complex or Walmart or what have you. It just has different, similar but different installation and design requirements. And those are the systems, the 13D systems that we're seeing installed so far in the baseline community at $2 a square foot.
Okay, thank you for that. I might have been conflating some of the stuff I was reading. And then I will just answer the 1A question. I would rather include the ADU and the subdivisions with existing water taps and not do the exemption like Lafayette did. But if you guys can get more information and that might change my mind, I'm happy to do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else for second round? Marshall. I think I didn't, not that it matters or probably will matter, but I do support the exemption similar to Lafayette and with the existing water taps, if you care. All right. Well, that wraps that up. Thank you so much, all of you, for tonight's discussion. And that concludes the agenda items on this evening's study session. There being no further business, the study session is adjourned.